The text below is a rewritten narrative in sophisticated, professional English. The flow, structure, and approximate length of the original sentences are preserved. The vocabulary is enriched to elevate the prose while keeping the tone measured, analytical, and professional, thereby avoiding inflammatory language that might trigger content warnings. The total word count has been maximized to meet your length requirements. At this very moment, as you observe these unfolding events, a conflict of immense proportions is being prosecuted not with ballistic missiles or mobilized infantry battalions, but with a weapon of infinitely greater potency, financial capital. And here is the stark reality that virtually no mainstream commentator is willing to articulate. The United States is currently in the process of losing this engagement. We are not speaking of a hypothetical defeat or a distant possibility. We are witnessing an active, ongoing forfeiture of dominance happening right now. The singular instrument that has underpinned American hegemony and made it the preeminent global superpower for 8 decades, the United States dollar, is being systematically dismantled piece by piece. The primary architect orchestrating this strategic takedown is none other than the People's Republic of China. They are executing this maneuver with such quiet precision and methodical calculation that by the time the general populace comprehends the magnitude of what has transpired, the window for effective countermeasures will have already closed definitively. This presentation is fundamentally about the collapse of dollar dominance, which arguably constitutes the single most consequential economic transformation occurring within our lifetimes. I am not referring to the quotidian volatility of stock market indices or the mundane fluctuations of quarterly gross domestic product figures. I am referring to the foundational power structure that has defined the architecture of the global economy since the conclusion of the Second World War. And that once impregnable structure is visibly crumbling before our eyes. It is imperative that you attend to this analysis until its conclusion because the trajectory of the dollar will have direct, tangible repercussions on the value of your accumulated savings, the security of your employment, the prices you remit for goods and services, and the geopolitical reality your progeny will inherit. This is not a discussion of abstract economic theory. This is an urgent examination of your lived reality. Allow me to illustrate the precise scenario that is unfolding at this exact moment today. While the vast majority of the public remains completely oblivious, central banks across the globe are liquidating U.S. Treasury bonds at a historically unprecedented velocity. Nations that have functioned as steadfast allies of the United States for decades are quietly ratifying bilateral agreements to conduct trade in currencies other than the U.S. dollar. China and Russia have ceased utilizing dollars for their bilateral trade settlements. Saudi Arabia, the nation whose immense petroleum exports have anchored the value of the dollar for half a century, is now actively discussing the sale of oil to China denominated in yuan rather than dollars. Simultaneously, global central banks are accumulating gold reserves with an urgency that suggests they anticipate a future where fiat currency is compromised. Throughout the years 2022 and 2023, these institutions purchased a greater volume of gold than at any other period in recorded history. Why are they taking these drastic measures? Because they are strategically preparing for a geopolitical landscape where the dollar no longer serves as the ultimate safe haven asset. The percentage of global foreign exchange reserves held in U.S. dollars has declined from over 70% just 2 decades ago to below 60% today. That statistic might initially appear to be a marginal shift, merely 10%, but we are speaking of trillions of dollars exiting the established system. These are trillions that are no longer buttressing American power or subsidizing American debt. And here is the factor that should instill genuine concern. This process is accelerating rapidly. It is not decelerating. It is not stabilizing. It is gaining momentum. Most mainstream news coverage will direct your attention toward tariffs, trade deficits, or the latest rhetorical skirmish between politicians. However, they will consistently fail to inform you about the structural collapse that is occurring beneath that superficial noise. This analysis will demonstrate exactly how China has been constructing an alternative financial architecture for the past 15 years. This is a system that does not require the U.S. dollar, does not depend on American banking institutions, and does not seek permission from Washington to operate. You will witness the specific mechanisms, the tangible infrastructure, and the verifiable data that prove this is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented, irrefutable fact. More importantly, you will come to understand why the United States is powerless to halt this progression. You will see why every maneuver Washington attempts to defend the dollar inadvertently accelerates its decline. You will understand why this issue transcends partisan politics, Democrats versus Republicans, left versus right. It concerns a fundamental realignment in global power that extends far beyond the tenure of any single administration or specific policy agenda. By the conclusion of this presentation, you will not only comprehend what is happening, but you will also understand why this outcome was historically inevitable, and you will know what it implies for your personal financial future. Because here is the unvarnished truth that virtually no one wishes to articulate publicly. The true conflict between America and China was never fundamentally about tariffs or trade imbalances. It was always at its core about this singular issue: who controls the currency? Who determines what possesses value? Who holds the sovereign power to punish and reward nations with the mere stroke of a pen? And regarding that specific war, it is effectively already concluded. China has emerged victorious. They achieved this not through overt military force, but through strategic patience and by meticulously constructing the infrastructure necessary for a post-dollar world. While America was distracted fighting the battles of yesterday, the pertinent question now is not whether the dollar will fall. The question is simply how rapidly, how deeply, and what the consequences will be for all of us when that inevitability arrives. Let us commence with the invisible war you likely never realized was being waged. There exists a specific form of power that rarely garners headlines. It does not manifest in military parades or in the grandiose speeches of world leaders. Yet, it remains the most devastating power a nation can possibly wield, and for 80 years, the United States has monopolized this power completely. Permit me to transport you back to the year 1944. World War II is still raging across Europe and the Pacific, but the prospective victors are already orchestrating the peace. In a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, representatives from 44 allied nations gather to redesign the architecture of the global financial system. The agreement they ultimately reach fundamentally alters the course of history. The US dollar is designated as the world's primary reserve currency, backed directly by gold. Every other currency is subsequently pegged to the dollar. If you desire to engage in international trade, you are compelled to utilize dollars. If you wish to hold national reserves, you hold dollars. The dollar thus becomes the bedrock foundation of all global commerce. Then, in 1971, President Nixon unilaterally terminates the gold standard. The dollar is no longer backed by anything tangible or physical. It is backed solely by the full faith and credit of the United States government. Economists of the era predicted immediate chaos. Instead, something truly remarkable occurred. The dollar became even more dominant than before. Why did this happen? Because of a brilliant strategic maneuver. The United States forged a pivotal agreement with Saudi Arabia and other major oil-producing nations. They agreed to sell their petroleum exclusively in US dollars. Thus, the petrodollar was born. Now, it wasn't merely that the dollar was convenient for trade. If you required oil, the veritable lifeblood of modern civilization, you had absolutely no choice. You needed dollars. This created what economists refer to as artificial demand. Countries were compelled to hold massive dollar reserves simply to maintain the functionality of their economies. They were required to purchase U.S. Treasury bonds. They were obligated to keep their funds deposited in American banking institutions. The United States could essentially print as much currency as it desired because the rest of the world was forced to absorb it. Consider the implications of this arrangement. America could sustain massive trade deficits year after year because other nations would accept those dollars and invest them directly back into U.S. debt. America could borrow capital at incredibly low interest rates because there was always persistent global demand for dollar-denominated assets. And most powerfully, America could effectively sever any country from the global financial system simply by blocking their access to dollars. This is precisely what the French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing termed an exorbitant privilege back in the 1960 seconds. And his assessment was correct. No other nation in recorded history has ever possessed this magnitude of financial power. For decades, this system appeared to be unshakable. The Soviet Union collapsed. Europe launched the euro, yet it never truly challenged the dollar's dominance. China was still in the nascent stages of emerging from poverty. The dollar remained undisputed king, and there was no viable pretender to the throne. But power of this magnitude inevitably breeds resentment. It creates profound vulnerability, because the moment you render the entire world dependent upon your currency, you provide them with an enormous incentive to discover an exit strategy. And here is the critical detail that most observers missed. That exit route was being constructed quietly and methodically by a nation that strategizes in terms of decades, while America strategizes merely in terms of election cycles. The invisible war is not fought with conventional weaponry. It is fought with patience and infrastructure. While America was wielding the dollar as a cudgel sanctioning countries, freezing assets, and weaponizing the financial system, China was observing, learning, and building. They understood a fundamental truth. You cannot defeat the dollar by attacking it directly. You defeat it by rendering it irrelevant. You achieve this by constructing alternative systems so comprehensive that nations no longer require the use of dollars at all. That is the conflict that has been unfolding, and most people are not even aware that it has commenced. So, what exactly constitutes this exorbitant privilege that rendered America so powerful? And why is it currently crumbling faster than anyone in Washington is willing to admit? Imagine possessing a credit card with absolutely no spending limit, zero interest charges, and no consequences for failing to repay the balance. That is essentially what the US dollar has provided America for the past 80 years. And that fiscal free ride is now concluding. Let me explain exactly how this exorbitant privilege functions. Because once you grasp the mechanics, you will realize why its collapse is so catastrophic. When France, Japan, or any other nation wishes to run a deficit, they must borrow money. And that capital comes with stringent conditions: higher interest rates, limits on government spending, and pressure from international institutions like the IMF. But America is different. The U.S. has maintained a trade deficit almost every single year since 1976. We are speaking of nearly 50 years of importing more than we export and consuming more than we produce. For any other nation, such a trajectory would be unsustainable. The currency would collapse, creditors would cease lending, and the economy would be forced into painful austerity measures. But not America. Here is the reason why. When the U.S. runs a deficit and requires borrowed capital, it issues Treasury bonds. And because the dollar is the global reserve currency, there is always persistent demand. China requires dollars for trade, so they purchase Treasury bonds. Japan requires dollars for their reserve holdings, so they purchase Treasury bonds. Saudi Arabia receives payment in dollars for their oil, so they purchase Treasury bonds. The result is that the U.S. borrows at artificially suppressed interest rates. We are talking about rates so low that, after accounting for inflation, America has often borrowed money at negative real interest rates. The world has literally paid America to accept their money. This dynamic allowed the U.S. to undertake actions no other nation could dare to dream of. We could prosecute 2 decades of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, costing trillions of dollars, and simply charge it to the national credit card. We could bail out the banking system in 2008 with $700 billion by simply printing the money. We could authorize multiple trillion-dollar stimulus packages during the COVID pandemic, causing the printing presses to run incessantly. If any other country attempted this, their currency would implode. But the dollar, it remained strong because the world had no viable choice but to continue using it. Now, let us discuss the weapon this privilege became. The U.S. did not merely enjoy the privilege of cheap borrowing, we possessed the power of exclusion. The global financial system operates on SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. It is essentially the messaging network that enables banks around the world to transfer funds to one another, and it is dominated by Western institutions, with the U.S. holding effective veto power. If America decides that you are an adversary, you get severed from SWIFT. Suddenly, your country cannot engage in international trade. Your banks cannot transfer funds. Your economy suffocates. We did this to Iran. We did this to North Korea. And the implicit threat of it has influenced the behavior of dozens of other nations. This is power that transcends military might. This is the power to economically strangle a nation without firing a single shot. But here is where the situation becomes intriguing. That power depended entirely on one condition: everyone continuing to need dollars. As long as trade was denominated in dollars, as long as reserves were held in dollars, and as long as there was no alternative, America's position remained secure. The numbers tell a story that should terrify anyone who is paying attention. In 2001, the dollar accounted for 73% of global foreign exchange reserves. By 2023, that figure had fallen to 58%. You might think, okay, 58% is still dominant, but you would be missing the critical point. The trend is what matters, and the trend is accelerating. In 2022 alone, central banks around the world dumped over $1 trillion worth of U.S. Treasury bonds. $1 trillion in a single year. These are not random investors engaging in panic selling. These are central banks, the most conservative, risk-averse institutions in the world, deliberately reducing their exposure to the dollar. At the same time, these very same central banks purchased 1,136 tons of gold in 2022. Then they purchased another 1,037 tons in 2023. These represent the highest levels of central bank gold purchases ever recorded in modern history. What does that signal to you? It signals that the most astute money managers in the world, the individuals who manage the reserves of entire nations, are actively preparing for a world where the dollar is no longer the safe haven. Here is what most people fail to understand about reserve currencies. They do not collapse overnight. The decline is gradual, almost imperceptible, year by year, until suddenly it is not. The British pound served as the world's reserve currency for over a century. Its decline commenced after World War I, accelerated after World War II, and by the 1972, its dominance was essentially over. The entire process spanned approximately 50 years. But here is the critical difference. We inhabit a much faster world now. Information travels instantly. Capital flows at the speed of light. The dollar's decline, which began gradually in the 2000s, is now advancing at a pace that would have been unthinkable in the era of the British pound. And every time the U.S. utilizes the dollar as a weapon, freezing assets, imposing sanctions, or cutting countries off from the financial system, it accelerates this process because each action broadcasts the same message to the rest of the world. Your money isn't safe here. Find another option. So, what constituted the breaking point? What specific moment compelled the world to decide it was time to find an exit from the dollar system? The answer is February 2022. And what transpired next changed everything. On the 26th of February 2022, Russia awoke to discover that $300 billion of its foreign reserves capital it had carefully accumulated over decades had vanished. It was not stolen, not lost, but frozen. With the push of a button, the U.S. and its allies made Russia's money inaccessible, and in doing so, they sent a message to every country on Earth. Your money is only yours if we say so. Let me be clear about the significance of this event, because this moment will be studied by historians as the point of no return for dollar dominance. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the Western response was swift and unprecedented. Beyond military aid to Ukraine and beyond diplomatic isolation, the U.S. and European allies did something that had never been executed at this scale. They froze the foreign reserves of a major economy. Russia had been cautious. After the 2014 sanctions over Crimea, they had spent years building up a war chest. Over $600 billion in foreign reserves, carefully diversified across dollars, euros, gold, and other currencies. This was their insurance policy, their cushion against economic pressure. In 48 hours, half of it was gone, inaccessible, $300 billion sitting in Western banks that Russia could not touch. This was money they had earned through oil sales, gas exports, trade surpluses, and real economic activity, and it was frozen by a political decision. Now, I am not here to defend Russia's invasion. That is not the point. The point is what this action revealed to the rest of the world. Consider it from the perspective of China. You are sitting on over $3 trillion in foreign reserves, much of it in U.S. Treasury bonds. You have watched America freeze Venezuela's assets. You have watched the U.S. sanction Iran so severely that their economy contracted by 30%. And now you are watching $300 billion of Russian reserves money held in supposedly safe, liquid Western assets become worthless overnight. What conclusion would you draw? The answer is obvious. Any money you hold in the Western financial system is not truly yours. It is a loan you have made to the West, and they can recall it whenever they decide your politics do not align with theirs. India saw this. Brazil saw this. Saudi Arabia saw this. Turkey saw this. Even allies like France and Germany saw this and understood the implications. If this presentation has opened your eyes, please subscribe to the channel. The truth does not wait for permission. I will see you next time.